O Heavenly King, comfort the Spirit of truth throughout everywhere present and fill us all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls of good will. We've been talking about the transformation of God-given energies or drives from their sinful and fallen state, as we would say in theological terminology, in Christian anthropology, to the level of gifts of the Holy Spirit. So that has been our topic for the last two sessions, last 2 months. Okay, and so one of these energies or drives, motivators, is fear. People keep sending me text messages. All right, never mind. We all have experienced fear. We know what fear is about. And I'd just like to give you an example, a historical example. Now, here's a person that conducted himself with such authority, power, and presence that Winston Churchill writes in his diary at the Yalta meeting that he was going to make every effort not to stand up when this man entered the room. I'm talking about Joseph Stalin. But he says that his presence was so powerful that he couldn't stop himself from rising from his seat. Now, this same Joseph Stalin, when the Nazi Germans attacked the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, he was in such a state of paralysis by fear that he ran away from Moscow and hid in his suburban dacha, his holiday house. And he waited for the Politburo to come and arrest him and probably just shoot him. However, they came and they asked him to take control. Now, this is an example of a person who uses fear, transforms fear, not the way that we've been talking about it in our group, but I've heard the term transphobic. I don't know, Helen looks like this is not a regular kind of term. Somebody invented it. But anyway, I didn't. These sort of people often become tyrants. Their fear is so intense that they transform it. They actually use this energy in a negative way to dominate other people. Now, Hitler is another example, and there are many others. You know, all the Genghis Khans and you know, Pol Pots, and they're paranoid people who had so much fear. Look at pictures of Hitler. He always has a lot of fear in his eyes. His stance. It shows weakness. I don't want to go into it too much, but anyway, that's one way of trying to control fear. But here is an example from the New Testament. The disciple of the Lord, St. Peter. And as you know, he promised to the Lord at the mystical supper, at the Last Supper, that if everyone had left him, he would stay to the end, even if he had to die. And on that same night, he denied his master and teacher and Lord 3 times. It was devastating for him. Can you imagine that, after such promises? However, when the Lord accepts his repentance and says 3 times to him, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He'll ask 3 times. He says, yes, I love you. look after my sheep, tend my lambs. Okay. Then Peter receives, together with all the other disciples and the group of 120 on the day of Pentecost, he receives the Holy Spirit. This is the birthday of the church. The transformation is just absolutely incredible, because not long after, Peter and John, the youngest of the disciples, were at the temple, and they healed a lame man with the name of Jesus. And it caused a tremendous excitement, and 5,000 people were converted to Christ through their preaching at that time. Now, they were arrested by the officers of the Sanhedrin. That's the Supreme Council of the Jews of Israel, and the elders of the council threatened them, and they said, "Stop preaching this Jesus." And this Saint Peter, who denied Christ on that terrible night 3 times out of fear. This is, you can read about it in Acts chapter 4. Peter said with such conviction, strength, and courage to the whole Sanhedrin, the whole council, he said, "Who do you think we should listen to you, God or you people?" So here's another example from later church history. Saint Basil of Caesarea in Cappadocia was in the 370s fighting Arianism, and the Emperor Valens was visiting Asia Minor at that time in Cappadocia, and he actually sent the prefect of police to threaten Basil to submit to the will of the emperor, to bring everyone into sort of harmony, in inverted commas, to agree with the Arians. So when prefect Modestus came and said the things that the emperor told him to say, St. Basil replied and said, "Why should I be afraid of you? What can you do to me? If you want to dispossess me, I don't have many things. I've got a few books and a few old clothes, that's all. If you want to exile me, it's the Lord's earth. Everywhere I go, I'll be with the Lord. And if you torture me, my health is so bad that I'm going to die pretty quickly. And I'll be with my Lord whom I love and with whom I want to be anyway." So the prefect reported that to the emperor and said, "Look, this bishop has defeated us." Now, the emperor himself decided to come to Caesarea, and he spoke to St. Basil, and St. Basil stood up to him. And then the emperor said, "Okay, look, I'll actually attend a church service of yours." And he came, and the people of St. Basil's flocks were so focused on the service, on the liturgy, that nobody even noticed that the emperor came in. Nobody paid any attention to him. He was rather taken aback with that. But he saw, another reality. And this is the reality that I want to talk about, that, drives out fear. Because my talk today, my short talk, I have to keep track of this time. I don't know, we started about 5 past?
10 minutes.
Yep.
You've been talking.
I've been going for about 10 minutes. Yeah. Okay. So my topic of my short talk is perfect love drives out fear. They're the words of St. John the Evangelist in his first letter, chapter 4. Where in chapter 4 he says a lot about love, and God is love, etc. All right. Now, what is the essence of fear from a spiritual point of view? Well, it is our gut feel, our perception of our mortality. That's what all fear is connected to that. All fear is connected to the fear of physical death. That's what it is. And it begins from a biblical point of view from the Garden of Eden, because once our forefathers stretched their hands to the forbidden fruit, what happened to them? What God warned them. The day that you cross over that line, you're going to die. They didn't die physically, but they died spiritually. And death, the law of death, the law of sin had entered into them. And what did they feel? They felt that they were naked. What does that mean? Nakedness is a sense of our vulnerability. Okay? And so they felt fear. And what does Adam do? He tries to hide from God in the bushes. Absolutely crazy. All right. So, how can we return to that paradise, to that Garden of Eden that our forefathers had? Well, how can we return to that love that drives out fear? Well, there's a whole and systematic teaching of the Holy Fathers, the ascetic fathers, the desert fathers, on our progression according to certain spiritual steps. Okay? And basically our journey is from a kind of a carnal state in which fear is the dominant drive. Now, fear is God-given. A couple of weeks ago, I think it was on the Sunday of the Holy Cross, I spoke in my sermon about fear as a gift of God. It is given to us in this frame of our existence, in this life, physical life, to elicit a reaction of, fight or flight. We resist an enemy, a challenge, or if we assess that the challenge or enemy is too powerful, we then retreat. However, I said, fear cannot and should not paralyze us. And this is the story, with Stalin that I told you at the beginning. He was totally paralyzed by fear. He could not move. Okay? A man who had that presence, that Winston Churchill felt. So, what is this teaching? It goes something like this. We begin from the level of the slave. The slave is, the mentality of the slave is a person who is governed by fear. So he is afraid of punishment. So psychology would say negative reinforcement, right? Now, as he progresses in that, and the Holy Scripture, going back to the Old Testament, the book of Proverbs, tells us that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of God. Okay, so that's of course a slightly different type of fear than fear of dogs or phobias and stuff like that. But nevertheless, it is a fear because we are mortal and we have this fear. God uses this to begin our spiritual process, and that's what may be happening to a lot of people now in the current climate. What does a little child do when it is scared? It runs to its mum, to its mother. Who's our mum? Well, our Father in heaven, and His only begotten Son, who has given us an image of His love in the Mother of God. Okay? So that's the strongest image of God's love that we can relate to. So we run to that. Now, as the slave begins to keep the will of the master, he progresses to a state of the hired worker. Now, the hired worker, of course, expects a reward or payment. This is the mentality that wants a reward of, say, heaven or whatever, or blessings here on earth for being for ticking the right boxes, right? Eventually, however, as the person grows in obedience in God, he rises to the level that God wants from us. And that level is the level of which we hear on the night of Pascha, the resurrection, from the first chapter of St. John's Gospel, where he says that God has given us the authority or the power to become the children of God. Okay? All right. And when we become children of God and we return to the bosom of the Father, as also in that moving parable that is the Church gives us before Lent, the second preparatory Sunday, the parable of the prodigal son, how the prodigal son returns to the bosom of the Father, who of course represents God, and is embraced by him, lovingly. He had wandered far off into the far country. So when we are in our Father's house, when we feel this protection, what have we to fear? Fear disappears, and this is why the martyrs could say these things, and even the great hierarchs and so had absolutely no fear. Many Christians, children, we celebrate in July the memory of two martyrs, a mother and her son, Julita and Kyriakos. And he, little boy, was not afraid to respond to the governor and say, "I'm a Christian, get away from me. I'm not going to give up my faith." Right. So, how is that possible? That's possible through the grace of God, through that same grace received by the Church on the day of Pentecost 2,000 years ago, including that fearful Peter that made him so courageous. And that's how these energies work, returning to my theology group, that when they turn towards God, these same weaknesses become our strengths. Okay? So even fear, when it's reversed, it becomes great courage. It's paradoxical, but it is so. Now, I'd just like to finish off by saying that I often use the image of Peter in another context. Now, after the Lord Jesus Christ performed the miracle of the 5 loaves and 2 fishes and fed 5,000 families, he left his disciples and the people and went up onto a mountain to pray. And he told them to cross the Sea of Galilee in the boat. And late at night, a storm came up, and they felt really, really threatened, even though they were experienced fishermen. In the meantime, when their fear and terror was at its peak, the Lord appears to them, walking on water, and they became even more afraid because they thought it was a spirit. But he said, "Don't be afraid, it's me." And then Peter, once he was sure that it was their teacher, he said, "Teacher, if it's you, can I come out of the boat and walk towards you?" And the Lord said, "You may." So he came out of the boat and started walking. And everything was fine for a few steps, and then his focus shifted from Christ to the waves and the wind. And that, the negative, these negative stimuli, these negative signals elicited fear in him so much that he lost his faith completely and he began to drown. And he said, "Lord, help me." And Jesus Christ grabbed him by the hand and said, "Where's your faith?" So this is the essence of it. The overcoming of fear begins with faith. It grows through hope. And those 3 steps correspond to those steps that I was talking about before. Fear, reward, and love. So, yes, there you have it. So you have faith. As faith grows, it becomes hope. As hope grows, it becomes love. And that love drives out fear completely.
Okay, so thank you for that. Just so focus with trauma. So when I talk about trauma, I don't mean really terrible, it can be very terrible things obviously, but also too long-term stress, people that have adverse childhood experiences, but also too whether they be car accidents, stress at work, stress with families, everyday kind of things as well. So I guess people come in for various reasons. And at the end of the day, what I like to do is do a little bit of what we call psychoeducation, which just means kind of helping people understand where their emotions come from, where their feelings come from, but also to the physical sensations. And what that does is help them feel calmer about themselves. It helps them feel calmer about, once they understand what is actually happening in their body, it starts to give them a sense, not only a sense of understanding, but a little bit of a sense of control of what is going on in the world. And given that today there is a very little sense of control in the world that we're all going through at the moment, it would be helpful for us to just touch on it a little bit. So when I talk about emotions, feelings, sensations, they're all in the body, and they're all in the brain. So for a lot of people, they think psychologists, and a lot of psychologists do talk therapy, what's called cognitive behavioural therapy, whereby someone will talk about things, the psychologist will ask questions, and usually you're using your brain to think about events, situations, how you feel about things, how you think about things. What our thoughts do can either make us feel good about things, or our thoughts, if they're negative, can actually make us feel bad about things. So this isn't all just in our mind. Thoughts also impact our physiology. And what I mean by that is, for example, you might have a thought of, I'm not good enough, whether that be as a parent, as a partner, at work, in any sporting activity you do. That constant negative thought of, I'm not good enough, starts to impact how you feel. And it may make you feel inadequate. It may make you feel as though, oh, well, what's the point? I won't keep on trying. Or may make you give up. And what it does is it has a snowball effect. So those feelings of inadequacy may come in, pain in the tummy, tightness in the chest. It might come in heart palpitations. It might come in, if it's long enough, it starts to impact the body in various ways. It's different for everybody. It might be high blood pressure after a while. Things depend on how much stress you have and how much stress you absorb. And when I say absorb, I talk about boundaries. At the moment, we are all experiencing something that's unprecedented. And we're not alone. Well, you're not alone in this. As Christians, I suppose, we have God. And by no means am I going to take the theological perspective, because I'll leave that for Father Nick, obviously. But I think for us, I feel, and I'll speak only just for myself, obviously, I have a sense of, obviously, concern, but overall calm, in the sense that everything is actually out of my control on a global scale. I can't control things globally. but I can control them on an individual basis. What does that look like for you? What does it look like for you? Isolation currently, potentially. Okay, what can you do within your day to control any fear that you or those around you may have? What do you do now? With that, what do you notice in your body? Fear is an activation by a part of the brain. All of us are a nervous system at the end of the day. Fear is a part of our brain that tells us we're not safe. And that might mean not safe in the sense of I don't have enough food, I don't have shelter, I don't have water, I don't have enough money in my bank account. Fear could be related to numerous things, but at the moment it's the fear of the unknown. And what I really want to stress is that perfectly normal to think that I'm scared. This is a pandemic. This is something that for the vast majority, we haven't experienced this as a culture, as a society, or as families. Having said that, the part of our brain that says you're in danger is also a part that is unconscious to a very large degree. And I'm talking obviously from a secular and a physiological perspective. That part of our brain that says we're fear, fight, flight is unconscious. What we need to do is learn a couple of techniques. One of those techniques I can talk about just really briefly, hopefully you've all got a piece of paper and a pen, is the stop technique. And that's literally STOPP. So a stop technique is literally stop. So be mindful of where you are, just literally in this moment. So if the thoughts are negative or your heart, you notice your heart is racing, you're feeling sick in your stomach, you're starting to sweat, you're overly stressed or anxious, let's stop. Take a step back or take a breath. So when I say take a breath, it's literally breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Just breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. And the slower, the better. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to hold anything. Just breathing in through your nose.
Does that massage your solar plexus?
Well, actually, funny you say that, Father Nick. There is a part of our body, the diaphragm.
The diaphragm that is connected.
Yes,
to that,
very much so. And what that does is there's a part of our body, you don't need to know this, but I was talking to Father Nick earlier about it, the vagus nerve. And it's a part of our body that actually is the brake in our body. And it's the brake that typically works and says, you know what, when we're too high activated, so that's that fight or flight reflex, we're biologically wired, we're physiologically wired for that to occur in times of threat. It's to keep us safe. But for some people that experienced prolonged trauma or severe stress over a chronic period of time, what happens is that fight and flight reflex actually gets stuck on and it can't switch off. And so a person's physiological responses, heart racing, sweating hands, racing thoughts, forgetfulness, stomach, butterflies in the stomach, all those physiological symptoms, are maintained constantly. And we're talking days, weeks, months, years. And that is actually an unnatural physiological state to also be in. That causes a lot of potential damage to organs and to yourself. It's not meant to be long term. But what we're wanting to do is actually bring ourselves, our nervous system, if you like, into a state of calm. Now, our nervous system, if you can see my hand, is just a state of flow. There's ups and there's downs, but they're gentle, okay? Activation of fight-flight is high. That is unconscious. There's no logical. The logical reasoning part of the brain will actually disconnect. when we're in a state of fight or flight, and that's wired for that reason, because we're meant to react. But what we want to do is then actually slow down and think, okay, hang on a second, needing to stop, take a breath, and then observe. Okay, what is actually happening? What are you responding to? Are you responding to your thoughts? What are your thoughts? What are you saying to yourself? Am I unsafe? Am I the world's gonna... What is going on in terms of your thoughts? Perfectly normal being scared, perfectly normal wondering what is going on, to a degree. If those thoughts take up too much of your time, and just excuse the wobbling a little bit, they're just bringing the camera closer. Thank you. If those thoughts take up too much of your day, if your worry is preoccupying your time and your activities and your life, then that is something that we need to address. Worry doesn't actually problem solve. Okay? So if you can actually just think it through, with worrying, you don't do anything. Okay? So we need to observe what is going on. So you're noticing the physiological reactions in your body. Are you stressed? Are you nervous? What are you thinking? Okay, what are those in response to? If the thoughts are negative, what we need to do is actually, okay, literally say stop. Stop those thoughts. And as simple as that sounds, obviously it's very hard to do. And I'll teach you some other techniques as well. With that, with the observing, it's the pause, that's the other P, to just pause and reflect, okay, what am I needing to do? What am I actually needing? If you notice that with your thoughts, if they're only focused on the negative, the only thing you're going to see is negative. It will just re-loop. It's like worst case scenario, catastrophizing. There's nothing that's going to come out of catastrophizing that's going to be good. They're all going to be worst case scenarios. And as humans, we tend to do that in an attempt to control our environment, in an attempt for us to prepare as much as possible and plan to a degree. But in the current situation, we can only plan and prepare for so much. What we need to do is also then give up to God, to say, hang on a second, there's only so much that I can do. But what I can do my bit. I can isolate myself, I can keep my family safe, I can organise food. Australia is an exporter of food and product. We are not going to run out of food or any other supplies anytime soon. So to realise and say, hang on a second, where are my thoughts going? There is enough food at the shops, there is enough food for my family, there's enough food for my friends. Australia is an island. We have stopped all travel in and out of the country, so really we're contained. The medical systems are doing their absolute best to contain what is going on at the moment. And I've got immediate family that are literally on the front line of the containment, I suppose, at the moment with, being a doctor and a paramedic student. So people are doing their very best to keep the rest of us safe. So how do we contribute to that? How do we help ourselves to help others? What happens is when fear is we begin to get that sense of, I have no control. But if you actually stop and pause and reflect, what you're doing, staying home and isolating, is actually doing the very best that you can to help yourselves, your family, and each other, and people that you don't even know. So at the moment, what you're doing, just by isolation, is actually saving people's lives. That's a change in thinking, yeah? So that's actually a little bit of a cognitive shift to say, well, you know what? It's a real struggle to say, well, what am I doing? I'm just staying home doing nothing. Well, actually, what you're doing is already saving people's lives by staying home. The other thing, what you another part of the pause is to proceed. So after you've paused, you've reflected, the second P is to proceed. What actually nourishes you? So people typically know when they're stressed, and they know that to react or with anxiety or that sense of overwhelm, needing to either fight or to flee. But when they've kind of calmed down and to say, okay, hang on a second, what gives me nourishment? And it's like, what am I able to focus on? And whilst we're at home, maybe it's your children, and people say, well, I've got my children 24/7. It's like, that's a blessing. Cognitive shift, to flip the thinking and say, you know what, this isn't going to last forever. So we have our children, and whether they be young or whether they be old, we have our children, and we've actually been given a chance to slow down, which if you can reflect on where we were even 2 months ago, our way of living these days is incredibly fast. And what we're actually struggling with is a slowing down. And for us, it feels very unnatural. It feels not quite normal. And I'm young enough to remember back in the day when really there was nowhere to go on the weekend. There were no shops that were open, and you went to church on Sundays. You caught up to family, and which we can now do on Zoom and Skype and all the rest of it, or call. And life was indeed slower. What you need to realise is also too, when you talk about the proceeding, what do you want to do that gives, or what can you do that enables you to feel calm within yourself, with your faith, with your religion? Is it singing? Is it the hymns? Is it looking at icons? Is it reading? Is it reconnecting to things that you notice and that you are aware of that calm you down, that regulate you, that you feel able to take your own breath in your own time? Yeah? That's one technique. That's the stop technique. So stop, literally stop, take a breath, observe what is happening. What are you responding to? Are you responding to the danger in your immediate environment, or are you responding to your thoughts? Are your thoughts negative? Okay, if they're negative, what exactly is feeding them? Okay, reflect, hang on a second, challenge those thoughts. Am I immediate danger? No. If you are, call 000. If you're not, okay, well, I am safe. My family's safe. Challenge the thoughts. Look for information that supports that negative thought and information that negates that negative thought. When you've all done that, and then pause, and then proceed with caution. And say, okay, we'll proceed with caution. Be mindful of where your thoughts are going and what your actions are guiding to. So that's the stop. Any questions?
Oh, there are a couple of questions.
Okay, well, I'm happy to take. Yeah.
That was only as long as I spoke for.
Oh, I've got more. Don't worry. I've got heaps, but I could talk all night, Father Nick.
The questions will get you going.
Yep, no, I've got heaps, but I'd like to direct it so people feel that they're heard and they've got the information. So that's just one technique.
So the first question was, what do you do when you see your teenager not making decisions for themselves for fear of failure, particularly when they have OCD?
Oh, that's not a short answer. Only because of the OCD and the fear of failure, and a teenager. So it's a multi-level. That's a multi-level answer. I'm happy to talk to that person privately if they're happy for me to. If they're happy for me to have their mobile, I'm happy to bring them back. I'm happy to talk to that person back. I can bring them back because it's a pretty specific.
Particular question. Okay.
Trying to make it more general.
An anonymous, well, I didn't say the other.
No, they're all anonymous. But
they're all anonymous. Okay, so what if our fear is not of death from virus, but fear of being locked up physically without an end in sight?
Well, absolutely. And I guess the reality is there will be an end. It can't last. So, but again, to notice, okay, well, where is that thought coming from? So it's there's no end in sight. Well, it's like, well, okay, we've not lived through a pandemic before. So for our generation, this is really new. And with that newness comes uncertainty. With that new scenario comes information that we don't have. So there will be gaps in information, absolutely, at the moment. And I guess the last pandemic we had was the Spanish flu back in 1918. And we didn't have all the social media and the information coming in 24/7 as we do now. Having said that, what our brain likes to do, it hates having gaps of information. It doesn't like it. And what it will do is it will put false information into our brain. It will find it from somewhere. It will even make it up. But it will put false information in our brain and fill in that gap. It would rather hear false information than no information. So it's very important for us to remind ourselves that, eventually this too will pass. When? You're right, I don't have an answer. But what we're trying to do is actually everything that we need to do at the moment to control the situation. In terms of, no end in sight, they keep on saying this is the new normal. So really for us to then say, okay, how do I make that work for me? So instead of us fighting it and saying, I need to go back to where I was, I need to go back and do it, there's no point for us to look back because we cannot look back. Those options for the moment are closed to us. So what we need to do is think outside the box and think, okay, if this is the new normal, how does that work for me? What is it that I can do to make this work for me? And needing to be creative and needing to connect to other people. Connection to other people is really important. Even though we are physically isolated, our brain is actually wired for human connection. So human connection is vitally important, particularly in these times of physical isolation. And as you can imagine, I don't know if anyone saw on YouTube, and imagine if you did, the Italians out in the balcony singing to each other. That need to connect, but also too with music, with song, connecting each other, and also too hearing the sound is vitally important, and also too calming, very calming. So think of when you come to church, think of when you listen to the choir singing, just it redirects you elsewhere, and just that sense of calm. Okay?
Right, wait a minute, I'll just give you the next question. All right, it's addressed to both of us.
Okay.
Please address that issue for many Orthodox of the dichotomy thinking. I am not good enough, negative thoughts, yep, and the sort of idea from Orthodox ascetic culture. I am the first among sinners. That's from St. Paul. Do you want to address that one, or?
I might hear your version.
You can address the one, I'm not good enough, and I'll address the first among sinners.
Okay, that sounds good.
All right.
So I guess as in terms of negative thoughts, it's okay. I'm trying to work this out. Negative thoughts are automatic. In terms of the theory, okay, so we're going theoretical. So the theory is negative thoughts are automatic, but it's not so much in and of themselves that, oh, well, I'm not good enough. That's also language. I'm not good enough at at playing cricket, as opposed to I'm not good enough in general, and how much those automatic thoughts occupy, again, your day. If you only consume yourself with I'm not good enough, and they're a large part of your day for 12 hours of your waking day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks of the year, then that will also have the physiological impact of that sense of unworthiness, or potentially that sense of low mood to say, well, I'm not good enough, full stop. And there is a distinction, and I will leave it to Father Nick, but from a secular and psychological perspective, if a client comes in and just says, well, I'm just not good enough, and it will just be that sense of overwhelm and that sense of just freeze response of just, well, what's the point in living? I'm just not good enough. So that is something that we, from a psychological perspective, need to challenge and actually say, hang on a second, it's really tightening it to I'm not good enough to particular activities, but from a religious perspective of realising that we're all sinners, that's a different tone that I'll separate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I
please
answer the second part? All right.
Yeah.
That's a big question in itself.
It's huge, yes.
Huge, every one of those questions. So, look, the differences between the axiomatic sort of baseline, because secular psychology is obviously humanistic, and so it just looks at the human being as is.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the Orthodox Christian axiomatic baseline is quite different, because we are not alone.
Yeah.
And as the fathers say, God gives you being, which means that He is closer to you than you are to yourself.
Yeah.
Right. So the deepest level of self is God. This is where you have to connect with yourself at the deepest level. Yeah. Right? Now, if a purely secular psychology will talk about building up your sense of self-worth based on the human being as is. Christian anthropology, which includes three aspects. It includes pneumatology, that's the spiritual side, psychology, and the teaching of the body. So 3 levels. Okay, so that is a huge sort of area too. Now, we can begin, or rather, in the teaching of the Orthodox ascetic fathers, and not only them, but it begins from the New Testament. The Lord Jesus Christ begins to teach us about humility. Look where He's born, the King of Kings. He's born in a cave and placed in a manger. What's a manger? It's a box, a feed trough. Okay? People forget that. Crèche, that's a French word. It means feed trough in French. Okay? It comes from the Gospels. All right. For instance, in Russian, yasli, that's a feed trough. Again, crèche for kids. Comes from Christ. Okay? So, wow, Christianity has contributed a lot to European culture and to all the world culture. But anyway, so in Christian Orthodox, say, psychology and pneumatology, that's spiritual life, we begin by humbling ourselves in the same way that Christ is teaching us. He says, "Learn from me, for I am meek and humble of heart, and you will find peace for yourself." Okay? Because why are people often anxious? Because of the competitive nature of the world that we're in. we are alienated
Yeah.
competitors and potential enemies, all right? So that makes us feel very insecure. And the way that humanistic psychology would try to allay those anxieties and fears and say, look, say something like, no, I'm sorry, I'm not making fun of secular psychology by any means. Otherwise, why would I have called you here?
I know.
Okay.
We have to call it for what it is.
I have the greatest respect, but
it has its limitations.
It's like saying, like Muhammad Ali, I am the greatest. Okay, and if you begin to believe that, maybe you'll feel good and you feel I am the greatest. Okay, but St. Paul says, sinners of whom I'm chief.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a different baseline. It's a process where we are taught to put aside our false persona, okay? Because we've been building up falsehood through our life from about the age of 2, okay? We see other people lying, we see our parents lying, and kids often give their parents away, don't they?
Often,
okay? So we have to come to grips what is real about ourselves and what is false.
Yeah.
And humility is precisely that truth.
Yeah.
It's not, making a doormat out of yourself. It's not that at all. And as a matter of fact, unfortunately, popular Orthodox culture sometimes thinks that putting a person down is good for them.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Well, that's wrong too.
Yeah.
Because that's a wrong understanding of what humility is about too. Because you do have to give support to children and to people who are weak, in spirit. And I have to confess that it was a kind of a discovery for me when, a number of years ago, my baby sister, Abbas Amma, gave me a book about another Abbas. Abbas Arsenia lived about 100 years ago in Russia, more than 100 years ago. And when she was a novice, she would come to her spiritual mother and say to her, Mother, please cheer me up. And her spiritual mother would start praising her. Okay, so that is quite lawful.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of the Orthodox, popular culture seems to think that you can't praise anyone because it's bad for them. Well, sometimes you have to be measured in that, because if a person relies on that and feeds off that excessively, then it's not good for them. They need a bit, a dose of reality. But if a person is weak, if a person needs support, then it has to be given. A bit of praise, there's nothing wrong with that. All right? Okay, look, that's enough.
I was going to say, just within that too, I think it's possible, and I'm just talking from a psychological perspective. There's another theoretical school that I use, that human beings don't have to be one or a certain something, or either all or nothing. There are various parts of us, and those parts can be both negative and positive, and not that they even need to have attributes of negative and positive. And for us to look at the different parts of ourselves, whether they be thoughts, whether they be sensations, whether they be emotions, or even actions, to say, okay, to look at them non-judgmentally rather, and say, okay, well, what is that part about? Because if you think about it, every person's behaviour is communicative. So even the person that is most intellectually disabled is able to communicate their needs very simply, and it needn't be through language, it need be through behaviour. We will instinctually either go towards something if we want it, or if it feels agreeable, or we will physically withdraw from something if it's disagreeable. Okay, so on a fundamental level, we're able to communicate. But for us as individuals to again pause and reflect, what is our behaviour? And we need to have that ability to self-reflect and say, okay, whether it be the words that come out of my mouth, whether it be the thoughts that are in my head, whether it be the actions by my own hand, what am I communicating? And if we don't know that, to then reflect, and whether it's then to think about, okay, you can be several things at once, I think, is what I'm going towards, and accept them all non-judgmentally. Because they are all part of us, and at the end of the day, I think, to realise that there is something above us, obviously in God, to say, well, good, bad, we're human, and as humans we have frailties, we have faults, we're imperfections, and that's for anyone to think that we need to strive to be perfect, obviously, but it's in the striving we need to strive. So,
okay, this question here: what philosophies of secular modern psychology do you see as misguided? Well, for instance,
quite a lot actually.
I, for instance, remember that in the first half of the 20th century, for instance, Freudian school was very influential. But by the time I got to, a little bit of psychology at university in the early 70s, Freud was already frowned upon.
Oh, there's so many schools, and I think what's happening now, I mean, every clinician, as a human being, we learn through our own lens, our own bias lens, I suppose. So for me, I've chosen to learn, I suppose, through my own bias lens. And with that, what I mean is I've chosen to focus on trauma, only because I've got a background as an emergency first responder, and trauma was all around me, really. So that to alleviate trauma was of interest to me. So that's what informed my training and my learning, and that has been post-university. In university, we don't actually learn a lot about trauma. You'd be horrified to know. But every person has their own lens with which they learn. Schools used to be, you had to learn the psychoanalytical way, whereas now it's very much, it's changed, and it's they teach you cognitive behavioural therapy only because it's the easiest to teach. And everyone comes out with that. If you want to learn something different, that's very much at your own cost, at your own time.
Helen, I'd like to ask you a question. How do you see, I mean, you've mentioned some things about the brain and this and that at the beginning, and I'd like to ask you concerning, the recent discoveries due to imaging technologies, discoveries about the, brain function as such. How has that contributed to the understanding of the central nervous system and its connection with, the psychological level?
Fundamentally changed it, actually. So that's a really great question. Thanks, Father Nick. And that's part of that. Part of our learning has been literally in the last 10, 20 years. What we now know about the brain and what we're learning about the brain in science and through research is that it's actually has incredible capacities, and what we're learning is that it's actually there's neuroplasticity, and with the word neuroplasticity, that means that the brain can actually learn things which 30, 40, 50 years ago we didn't think was possible. So if you can imagine particularly people that have had maybe a car accident or, again, even trauma. I'll go back to trauma. I always go back to trauma. So in terms of trauma, particularly for children that have lived through severe abuse, severe childhood abuse, what we do know of trauma is that it actually changes the wiring of the brain. So as the child is developing, it impacts the development of the brain, and it doesn't grow normally. What that does is, people that have suffered extreme abuse do also suffer in terms of academically, in terms of struggling to make relationships work, struggle to socialise, live in a constant state of fear, because as a child they weren't able to establish a connection with a safe and stable caregiver. So what they've learnt is literally that their world is unsafe for them. So if you can imagine, as a child grows and into an adult, well, that nervous system at a fundamental level, let alone then the cognition coming into it later, is that, well, no one's safe. I can't trust you. I couldn't trust mum or dad or granddad or grandma or whoever it was. Why should I trust you? And not only that, not only do I not trust you or my teacher or my priest or my next door neighbour, but I actually don't trust myself, because I've always get into trouble, or I don't feel safe. And when I mean I don't feel safe, I mean I don't feel safe in my own body, let alone in my own house, in my own bed, in my own home. So really what we're learning now is like, well, that's in a time, day of old, we would have said, oh, that's terrible. But what we're learning now is the last 10, 12, 20 years is that the brain can actually rewire. So, which is pretty exciting. So, which is what a lot of the trauma therapy that I do is in rewiring the brain. And when we talk about that, it's talking about really addressing components of trauma that have gone on, that are very much locked into the nervous system. Because decades ago, it's always very much, we didn't understand how trauma worked because we didn't understand how the brain worked. And it was like, well, no amount of talking would resolve the trauma. So you could talk about it, but the body would still react to triggers. So whether it was a smell, a sound, you saw a fire engine or you heard the fire, people would still react to traumatic reminders of their original trauma. What we're knowing now, what we are seeing now through medical imaging of the brain and understanding of the body, is that actually the body is connected to the brain, and the body is actually sending the signals to the brain, not only the brain sending the signals to the body. So in the days of old, we'd say, okay, well, what were you thinking when you should have fought off that attacker. You should have said something. You should have screamed louder. You should have, all these shoulds. And what we now know is actually, well, no, that thinking, logical, rational part of the brain disconnects in moments of extreme terror and trauma and stress. And the mammalian brain, if it kicks in, that fight, flight, freeze response, which is protective. From a physiological perspective, it's protective. And there's a chemical and a hormonal dump that comes in during those three stages, fight, flight, freeze. What then happens is we're also getting signals to our body, from our body to our brain. And this also plays into today with the sense of forced isolation. We're getting signals that it's not safe to be outside. We're getting signals it's not safe to be close to each other. We're getting signals that we're needing to wear face masks if we're talking. We're getting signals that it's not safe. So naturally, why wouldn't one actually start to increase and get that sense of anxiety? Because the signals that we're getting from our environment, that we're seeing on our TV, that the streets are empty, the shops are closed, there's no toilet paper on the shelves, it engenders that sense of panic. And what we're needing to do is actually say, hang on a second, again, stop. Okay, take a deep breath. Yeah, just notice that tension in your stomach. Yeah, so if you've still got the symptoms, take another breath. And you take the breath until the symptoms dissipate. Yeah, one breath isn't going to do it. I can teach another technique as well. you need to ground us. We all need to ground ourselves. And when I say ground ourselves, our body is going to be picking up cues, especially moving forward in the next, months, really, because we're going to be in lockdown for months to come. So our body is going to get the sense of, there's no one around me. Am I going to get in trouble? Should I be out here? Should I be at home? Am I doing the wrong thing? Is it okay? Starting to question ourselves, starting to ask ourselves questions which we didn't ask ourselves a month ago. So what we need to notice is stop, observe. What am I saying to myself? I'm actually okay. I'm in a safe country. It's all right. I'm trying to do the right thing. Just going to go out and get some milk. I'm going to go back. It's fine. To notice what our mind is doing, but also to what our body is doing. So for here, moving on forward, if you don't, people are different. Some people notice their mind races with thoughts. Other people say, I'm fine, I'm not stressed. But they have high blood pressure. Or I'm fine, I don't have any issues, but have irritable bowel syndrome. Or I'm fine, but, have other health issues that, when you look at it, really are all also trauma related. Because underneath, the nervous system is doing that fight-flight response, which the person is unconscious of, but the body is responding. So needing to look at that, okay, well, do I have digestive issues constantly? And what is that about? Am I just in a state of constant stress and anxiety? Okay, and it's like, well, COVID is a pandemic. It is something for us to all be say, okay, this is different. But by the same token, I'm doing everything I can within my immediate control that I can possibly do. Other than that, it has to be left up to God. That's the easiest explanation. If you can control what you can control, there's nothing else that you can physically do or worry about. If you want to contribute to the cause, there are, you can sew masks. You can sew medical kit. There's medical gear. So they're looking for sewers, so people that have got sewing machines. You can actually do something that you can donate it to hospitals, medical clinics, people that are on the... There are things that we can do as a community, that we can respond to each other in community and still connect and still help and have that Christian value of helping others in a time of need.
Well, what we're doing now is already, a positive response to the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so, to say
because,
it's okay.
We'd have, say, 20 to 30 people at our theology group, and I'll check with our webmaster.
Don't know that I want to know.
How many
yes.
people we're watching this
yes.
later on? Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Well, here's a question to you, Helen. What sorts of questions should a Christian ask when looking for a psychologist? In this instance, all my young children need trauma counselling after the sudden death of their father, but the services I have contacted have made it clear that they leave religion out of the picture. Is it better to just then see a priest?
It would. I'm sorry to hear of your loss. First of all, I think there's a couple of components to that. Of course, I would see a priest, but also it's twofold, because it's spiritual. By all means, and faith would come into it, and understanding how loss and death comes into faith, and how that's allowed to happen. But also too, from a psychological perspective, there are psychologists that are Christian based, or are Christian psychologists. So by all means, if I can remember, I can maybe pass on the group.
Maybe you can give me some
connections.
Some connections.
That
I think that would be very, very useful. I mean,
yes.
I know a couple, and actually the person who's asking this question, I will contact her later and suggest a psychologist closer to her.
Yeah.
Where she is,
and also too, just depending, I guess, on the age of the children as well, because
yes.
whilst grief is a natural part of life, I think it depends on, and as a psychologist, I would ask, how recently has the loss been, and how are the children coping, and also the ages of the children, and in terms of trauma, I would also probably, and I'm biased because I work from a trauma lens, obviously, but I would look at an EMDR specialist as well, or an EMDR clinician, which is eye movement desensitization. Again, I can give that information to Father Nick, or a play therapist as well, because children are unable to articulate, which is why I ask the age.
Mm-hmm. By the way, I've had several people responding, beginning with our webmaster, saying that, well, at first there were 80 live people, 80 live, watching live, and then 83.
Oh, nice.
As we speak.
Lovely. Thank you.
That's not a nice group, yeah.
That's lovely, good. That's great, thank you.
The webmaster has said more will watch it later.
Yes.
Because it comes up as a recording.
Yes, because not everyone can do it, of course.
Well, not everyone can do it on the night. And by the way, I think I mentioned that we have a cameraman down the back.
Absolutely.
Well, he's just a few paces behind.
This helps set up.
Yes, I think I mentioned that. So we will upload, God willing, a high resolution version of all of this, and with his camera he has probably made it more interesting than just having a laptop here, which we've had to shift closer to Helen anyway. All right, good. So look, while you get gathering thoughts, I would just like to mention I sort of left off my talk because I was concerned about the time ticking away. But of course, there is a lot that spiritual life and prayer can do to calm our anxiety.
Exactly.
Look, you cannot imagine how beneficial prayer is in that regard. And I can suggest a couple of things, for starters. Sitting down, for instance, if you can't sleep at night, get up, because when you're in bed, I find, probably you don't concur with that, when you're in your bed, you probably feel more vulnerable. When you get out, you start thinking
That's
more rationally.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because when you're in your bed, somebody can kind of attack you or something when you're lying down,
I haven't gone there, Father Nick, but okay.
I find that, if I get out of bed and you can just, if you have what's called a prayer rope, kombuskini in Greek, chotki in Russian, and you can say the Jesus prayer slowly. And look, you don't have to worry about, stratospheric flights of technique, in breathing and, mind to the heart and all that. Just say the prayer slowly. Sit on your, it's better sitting down on a chair because you're not making an effort to stand up when you're saying. It's different to say the Eucharistic liturgy when we stand and so just saying the Jesus prayer, Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. It comes in two forms, the short form and the slightly longer form, but the short form is sort of easier to start with anyway. Lord Jesus Christ, have mercy on me. Господи Иисусе Христе, помилуй меня. If you say about 300 of those,
you'll calm
slowly,
right down.
It'll calm you down. Guaranteed.
I think that's a really important point because, and this is the thing, we forget when we're in fear and our mind starts, we forget what's available to us.
Yes.
Such as prayer.
Connection.
Yes.
Connection
yes.
with,
yes.
As I said, someone who is at the most deepest level of our being, and who gives us our being. You know, we seem to think that God has created us and left us, you know, to our, you know, life and so on. In fact, he does not leave anyone. If he should leave, we will cease to exist, because he gives being.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the deepest level. Now, what I also have suggested to some people is get the Psalms, the book of Psalms. And especially, this is very popular in, I know, in Eastern Slavic, Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian sort of culture, to have, to use the 90th, or in the Hebrew Bible, 91st Psalm, that talks about the protection of God. And a lot of people in the past used to know that psalm off by heart. It's not very long, and I find that it gives a lot of, it's a wonderful prayer that reminds us of this care and protection that God gives to us. Okay, and at least I know that before the revolution, Russian soldiers used to go into battle wearing belts with embroidered words of that psalm, the 90th Psalm.
It's incredible.
And they were not afraid. You know, they were ready, as the enlightener of the Slavs, when he was still a layman, Constantine said to some Muslims, when they asked him, why do you Christians, you were told to love your enemies, and instead you get your swords and spears and fight us? Well, he said, look, that's one commandment, to love your enemies, but there's another one, to lay down your life for your close ones, for your loved ones. That's the greatest love. So, yeah. All right.
There's just a couple of, and I'm just thinking of the children actually, there's a couple of techniques that I can show using your hands and the body, which helps regulate anxiety. If that's, I'm just going to look at the camera and see and try and hopefully, I'm going to have to put the microphone down. So hopefully this works. So you can just teach, adults can use it too, but just, or children, but you just cross your hands, cross your arms in the shape, if you can see my hands moving like that, and then just put them under your collarbone and just tap, usually slowly. And when you're really anxious, particularly for children, this is something that you can teach them, that's really quite easy to do, or whether they're lying down in bed, sitting or what have you, it's just a matter of, or whether they say to themselves, I'm okay, it's going to be okay. And what typically happens is you do it slowly, and I start to rock instinctively. So noticing just the impulse of your body. And for some people, it brings them comfort. And if you can imagine, it's kind of like, patting a baby's bottom. You know, as you start to sway, you're holding the baby, you're swaying, and then you're patting the baby's bottom. But this is to self, obviously, okay? So sometimes just that sense of, and again, whether you do that deep breath, say, it's going to be okay. So that's one.
That's comforting. Yeah.
Just try. Okay? And the other one is, again, physical, so using your hands. So putting your right palm under your left armpit, so it's next to your heart, and then your right hand over your left arm. And then what you do is you actually squeeze in as much as possible, so as tight as possible. So for people that experience anxiety, what this does is actually remind them of where their body is in space. Because when you're anxious, you just feel uncontained, and it's overwhelming. So what this does is, so right palm, left armpit, and then left palm over right arm, and then squeeze in. And it reminds them of where their body is in space. So you can just sit there, and again, whether you want to rock, you don't need to, but just noticing what your body is inclined to do, or whether you want to rock forwards, you rock side to side. But again, for people that experience a lot of anxiety, that's also another technique that is calming. Mm-hmm. Another one is also to grounding. So when we say grounding, it's 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can touch, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. So again, using your senses to ground you, because when we experience anxiety, what our mind is actually doing is either going in the past or it's going into the future. It's not in the present. It's not being mindful. So what we want to do is actually tell the body, remind the body, and to say, hang on a second, I need you to come back from here or from over here, and to come back and to ground in the present. So what you actually do is really, really slowly just look around where you are. So what are 5 things you can see? And then name them to yourself. And what are 4 things that you can hear? So you pause. And what that does is it forces your brain to kick out of the fear centre. So it forces that part of your brain to gear down. And then 4 things you can hear, smell, taste, touch. And actually walk around and actually touch, actually smell, actually see what you can taste. And that's another grounding technique. Also too, that children can use too. And then conversely, another one that you can do is also the opposite of that. Okay, well, what are 5 things that you can see that give you, that make you feel calm? What are 4 things that you can hear that give you joy? What are 3 things that you can taste that, so on and so forth? That's another technique.
Well, we have 3 more questions coming up. Okay. Well, I'm just handling them in chronological order. That's so the first one is a quick one that I'll answer because, the question is, what sort of advice can you give to families at home following the Holy Week services from home? How best to approach this? Well, obviously, depending on, which parish you belong to, whether they have the live streaming in the culture that you're used to, right? Whether it's, Russian or Eastern Slavic or, Southern Slavic or Serbian, Greek, sorry, Serbian, Southern Slavic. You find a connection to live streaming because you cannot imagine how many people have said to me, and to other people, how touched and comforted they are being stuck at home, that they still have the ability to be present live during a service. That's an amazing gift of technology.
Absolutely.
So not everything in the modern world is bad. So,
not everything.
Not everything. Okay. So, the other thing is there is so much material available, like liturgical material available online. So if you look up the service materials, and for instance, if you watch live streaming and follow, if you've got books, all the better. But even like you can open up on an iPad or on a computer or something or a laptop and follow the text of the services. When was it? Last night, for part of our service, we had a laptop here.
That worked?
Because it had the whole service. We had other books as well, of course, but our choir master seems to like that. He uses it.
Yep.
You know, why not?
It works.
You know, I know that other people use it. Okay, now over to you, and I'll just ask you the next question chronologically.
Yep.
So, Helen, you mentioned cognitive changes due to trauma or injury in young people or children. How do these changes occur in the older person with injury? Due to increased age, is the cognitive effect less ingrained, or is it the opposite, that cognitive damage will be harder to treat due to lessened neuroplasticity? Sounds like a medical practitioner, medical professional asking a question.
I'm going to read that as does the trauma.
Okay, so you're talking about trauma in the young.
And the impact of the young.
This person is asking, in older person, is it harder to overcome because of lessened neuroplasticity?
No, not in my experience. And having said that, I've worked with. I used to work in a psychiatric hospital in their trauma program, and some of the patients I've worked with, if you there's two in particular that I'm thinking of, but essentially, really people that are into their late 60s, early 70s, that again using EMDR, which is what I'm trained in, as a trauma therapy, we were able to shift memories, and when I say shift memories, it's not wiping the slate clean. So that's not what this particular therapy does. You will still have the memories of events that have happened, but they will become distant, they will become in the past, and also too, it doesn't feel as though they're current. So the intensity of emotions as you reflect, as you recall the memories, will be decreased. And also too, what tends to happen is also too positive, and when I say positive, I mean adaptive thinking or adaptive information comes into the brain. Because typically, as you would all agree, children are not in control of their environment. So when things happen, it's not their fault. Yet, as adults, we grow up thinking it's my fault, I deserved it, what have you. But then it grows, what we do is with the therapy, realise, well, actually, you know what, I wasn't at fault. It's not I'm a good person, I did what I could, and I'm okay now. So adaptive information coming in. I hope that answers the question. So unless it's an acquired brain injury, which is a different story, or if there's something else but as in just old age, no, not necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Okay, just a quick comment here from someone. I have used the Jesus prayer on many occasions and come back you up saying it really works. And I've never had to go as far as 300 prayers. No, I didn't want to scare people. I shouldn't have said that.
Only for the devoted.
Look, it doesn't take all that long, actually, to say 300. No. It works anywhere for any situation, says this viewer. Okay, and right. Okay, there's... how do you feel? You're getting a bit tired?
No, I'm enjoying it.
You're enjoying it? Okay.
Yeah. If people are getting something out of it, I'm happy to continue.
Yeah, all right. Someone writes, only if you need another question. Please ask Helen's opinion on Jordan Peterson and John Fredrickson. His intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy.
It would work for certain people in certain situations. I don't have an opinion either way on any kind of therapy, only in the sense that different things work for different people. And I guess who am I to judge? Would be the short answer to that. And again, as I said earlier, it really depends on... some people have been... I will add... I think the onus is on the clinician, or it is on the clinician. The onus is on the therapist to actually say if what they're doing isn't helping the client, I have had people refer clients to me and have been in therapy for 15 years, and it's like talking to a friend, catching up, touching base. And I think it really needs, the clinician needs to have I suppose it's incumbent upon the clinician to say, look, either I can help you within my skill set, or I can't help you within my skill set. This is who you need to see and refer on. So, but as in terms of different people and authors and practices, different things work for different people.
Okay. Do you feel that you may like to add something just to round things off? Because normally in our theology group, we start at 7 and finish by 9.
Yep.
It's getting close to a quarter to 9.
Closer. Yep.
And maybe we should sort
Close
of
to
round
wrap
things
it
off.
up. I think it's perfectly. I think it's important for all of us to just keep in mind that we actually are in this together. And I think when individually we get stressed, typically it's something that we experience as individuals. So whether it be a personal family challenge or a challenge at work, or something with our child or children, we tend to think, in isolation it could just be us. And sometimes what that does is actually magnify the problem, or that sense of isolation for us that no one would understand. But I think, if anything, for me, the one thing that I've noticed through the work that I've been doing, particularly of late, is I don't think as humanity we've ever been as connected to each other as we are now. And I mean that in a good way. So I think for us to really be mindful again of where our thoughts are and to where our focus and attention is, to then actually say, hang on a second, let's also look at the positives. And if we want to look at negatives, that's all around us. But let's just focus on the positives and see what's there for us to take out of what we're experiencing today.
I think we might have a last question here, and then someone has written, not a question, but just thanking you.
Oh, thank you.
That's nice, I'll read that. But before that, Helen, your opinion on schema therapy and orthodoxy?
Yeah, thank you. I have been trained in schema therapy, and initially I thought it was incredible in terms of understanding an underlying sense of where people's difficulties were. I have since pulled away from schema therapy, and I have gone to internal family systems, which is more trauma informed, and only because schema therapy is very much, from memory, it's like 200, 300 and odd 300 odd questions, where it's, several questions where you asked yes, no, is it me? And I feel uncomfortable with putting people into boxes that others have designed, I suppose would be the short answer. Again, not to say that schema therapy doesn't work, and a lot of people swear by it, and again, it's a therapy and intervention, particularly for complex PTSD, so prolonged trauma. But again, I prefer to use internal family systems only because people will then identify the parts within themselves. So it's more organic, and are able to include their faith in it. Whereas schema, it's very, you're this, you're that, you're that, you're that, you're that. And for me, it doesn't work as a clinician. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work as a theory or as an intervention. I hope that answers your question.
Mm-hmm. I think the same question asked. Do you think that a psychotherapist who's not an Orthodox Christian can truly help those who are serious Orthodox Christians, even though they are really struggling with their faith and psychological anguish?
I think I would probably That's an interesting question. I don't know that a psychologist could really... it's almost like an existential question, and an existential issue, and I don't know that a psychologist is trained to help deal with challenges of an Orthodox Christian, because they wouldn't understand it. And if anything, they would put their bias of what Christianity is or what it's meant to be, and their interpretation of what you are potentially struggling with, not understanding Orthodox Christianity. I mean, there's not a lot of people that do. They just assume Orthodox Christianity is Christianity watered down, as so many denominations are these days. So my answer to that would be no. That's just an intuitive. That's just a gut, and I would probably refer to a priest in that. I would refer on to a priest for me individually. The other thing to that too would be also too, psychologists are trained to not to be, I suppose, impartial, if you like. That's they're meant to be. Not that they always are, but again, as I said earlier, everyone is brought up and trained with that bias or look at and interpret the world through a specific lens. So it would really depend. If you happen to meet or come across, a psychologist that's an atheist or agnostic or Buddhist or Hindu or what have you, would they be able to I don't know. That's a question that you would be legitimate in asking your therapist and having that discussion with them openly and honestly, and that if they say, no, I can't help you, which they should be, would be ethically bound to do, to say, look, I need to refer you on because that's something is outside my skill set and I can't help you deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Another question. If you're at work and feel anxious, what strategies can you use in that environment?
I do the breathing. There's another breathing one that I can teach you really quickly, and it's a little bit longer, it's a little bit more complicated. So basically it's called diaphragmatic breathing, and all that means is we need to engage the diaphragm. When we engage the diaphragm in our body, what that does is it taps into, again, as I was talking about, the vagus nerve, which is that brake in our body. And sometimes when we're constantly stressed, the brake actually forgets to kick in. And it, as I said, it stays in that constant state of stress. So as in terms, if we do the diaphragmatic breathing, it's a way of actually telling our body, hey, I need to gear down. So what we do is you breathe in through your nose. Just, if you can imagine you've got a balloon in your tummy and you're trying to expand that balloon. So breathe into your tummy as much as possible, breathing into the balloon. Breathe in, breathe it like a really big, and hold as long as you're comfortable. So that might be 10 seconds. I do 10 seconds, but it could be 5, 10 seconds. You don't have to burst your lungs if you don't have lung capacity. And then the trick is to actually breathe really slowly out through your mouth. And I mean really slowly. The slower the better. So I know, Father, you took a deep breath. Happy to do it with you. So what I'll do is I'll show you. So breathing in through the nose, so as much as you can. And then hold. And out through the mouth. Your out-breath should be twice as long as your in-breath. And as you're breathing out, notice your chest collapse, notice your diaphragm collapse, and pushing out all the air out of that balloon in your tummy and actually feeling the squish in your body. And then what you do is you breathe in again and then hold 5 to 10 seconds, and then breathing out through your mouth. Slow. So really, really slowly. Slower, the better. And noticing the chest collapse, noticing the diaphragm drop, noticing your stomach drop, and actually just noticing you push all the air. Just imagine pushing all the air out of your belly as much as you can. Yeah? And just that's 2 breaths. So we'll do just one more. So breathing in through your nose. Holding for as long as you're comfortable. So 5 to 10 seconds. And breathing out. Really slow. Really, really slow. Super, 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 super slow. So your out breath is longer, quite long, so about 10 seconds out breath. And then noticing your chest, your diaphragm, your stomach, and your tummy collapse. And then just check into your body. What do you notice? Did you do it, Father Nick?
Yeah, I did. Look, but I've also heard, decades ago that, the urban environment, say the office situation, like the stresses there, those hormones, cortisol and stuff, were given to us for fight or flight, but you can't do anything physical in the office.
What it is, that's exactly right. So the office environment is very much a threat.
Get up and start punching the air or something.
Well, you can't, but also too, the breath, or just that little one, would be one to actually say, because also too, you can be threatened at work, you can be being bullied at work, you can be intimidated by your boss, you can be having a deadline that you've missed or that you're not going to meet. So really that brings on that fear response of, am I going to lose my job? Am I going to get in trouble? But noticing that breath technique is something that really no one needs to know that you're doing it. So really in through the nose, hold for 5 to 10 seconds and breathe out. But by the same token, you need to be doing these techniques for a good 2 to 3 minutes. So it's not once or twice and thinking, oh my gosh, that's ridiculous, it doesn't work. So the consistency is the key.
Look, I think we might sort of start winding things down. A couple of questions by the same person. Borderline personality disorder and being Orthodox, comment on that, and because it's very much misunderstood.
Yep.
Dialectical behaviour therapy.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay, so so borderline really, for Australia at least, borderline personality more or less is also complex, is what I would call complex PTSD. For a lot of us would call complex PTSD. We need to call it borderline personality in Australia because the DSM-5, which is that big, thick book that all doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists use to diagnose, there is no complex PTSD in it. So as in terms of, for us, it'd be borderline, and historically borderlines have had a complicated, if you're diagnosed as borderline, then it's very much, because borderlines tend to access medical and psychiatric services quite a lot. But as in terms of, because of the trauma that they've experienced, typically, dialectical behaviour therapy is also good, and they teach you skills to manage symptoms, but it's not treating trauma. So it's very much addressing the symptoms and managing the symptoms.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a question for me here, and the big questions are now just ratcheting up. People were sitting and listening.
And now it's like they're finishing. Hang on a second, wait.
Yeah, because I said we're going to stop at 9 o'clock. All right. This is a question, I think, more for me. How do I prepare myself to go to church? Please help.
That's yours.
That's a good question. Look, the church, by church I gather you mean, the church building, like the space we're in at the moment, yeah? And the context of coming to a service. Well, the Orthodox culture, of the Spirit emphasizes very much that when we come into church, we are leaving the world behind. This is why our churches are decorated in this way that will help us to make this transition. So we leave those worries, anxieties, cares, everything behind. We're in our Father's house. We are being embraced. We are, when we look, at the icon of the Mother of God holding baby Jesus, that is a very deep archetypal message, sends to us that God is love. And this love will drive out fear. What do babies do when they're scared? You know, they stretch their little arms to their mum. Little kids, toddlers, what do they do? So this is us. So when we come into church, we are all brothers and sisters. Forget who you are in the world when you come here. You're no different to anybody else. And, you know, we are children of God. And that simplicity, if we are able to switch to that mode, it'll help us to rise to a level where that love of God is going to help us with our fears, with our stresses, anxieties, about the present, about the future. It really works. I can tell you.
It really does. I can concur as well.
Right. Another question is, thank you, and Helen, I think the streaming is great for us to see what we always see when we go to church normally. But for you, Father Nick, it would be completely different not to see a sea of faces looking back at just the bare walls.
Yeah.
You may ask Helen how to cope with the strange situation and the enormous weight of pulling the entire congregation through this ordeal. You know what? I'll answer that question.
Father Nick will answer.
No, personally, I'll handle that too. But,
please.
you know, in 1975, I finished my undergraduate studies in Sydney at the University of New South Wales, and I had almost a year to spare before going to seminary in the States. Okay, and so I think it was God's plan. He knew that I would have to do live streaming, so He got me into radio broadcasting.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so it's not hard for me at all to talk to people. You know, it actually helps to see some movement on the screen, even if I see myself or another person.
Yeah.
But even if I don't, if I'm in a studio, you know, in a radio station, I have no problem just feeling that I'm in contact with people anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think that, you know, thank God for that, because possibly it would have been difficult for me. But I don't sense this disconnect from the people on the other side of the screen, whom I don't see, but I feel.
Yeah.
I feel connected. Okay. You're going to comment about that?
I too feel connected. I guess I have done also live streams just from my practice, and posted to Facebook or what have you. So it's initially awkward because you think, gosh, I'm talking to a computer screen. But when you realise, particularly for today, obviously because it's a live stream, so it's different, that you know there are people watching and listening, but also too when the phone tings and you realise that there is that activity and communication happening and connection between all of us. So even though you know, there's three of us here, and we're maintaining physical distancing, I'll add, but there is still that connection with community that I too also feel. So I hope that that comes through to all of you as well.
Okay, look, we are about to hit the magic, 9 o'clock.
Oh my gosh, yes we are.
Time flies when you're having fun.
It did.
As they say.
It did.
And there's a couple of questions addressed to me, which I think what I'll do is I'll just handle those people separately later on. One question, I'll read the questions out. Father, are there known saints who suffered with mental health stress, anxiety? Okay, I'll answer that one later, and maybe we can just save it for our next month's theology group. session, and there's an insistent person here says, please answer this last question. Accepting and dealing with being a sinner can be a source of despondency. How would you, from a psychological perspective, deal with such self-hate despondency? How does one find a place to sit healthily as an Orthodox Christian, finding a spiritual balance and finding peace? Okay, look, I know how to answer that question, but would you like to say something about that?
I'll do it from a psychological and I'll combine it with Orthodox psychology, only orthodoxy, only because I guess we're all sinners. To then have that self-loathing and self-hate, I think that stems from other things, because I think if we actually understand that we're all sinners in terms of our faith, and that we're not perfect, but we're striving to be towards perfection, which is towards God, towards Christ, then because we do fall, and I speak for myself, I fall regularly and often, and I think the idea is obviously then for us to get up. And for us to seek, confession and then repentance, and that is the medicine from a. And I'm not going to expand. I'm just doing this for me, because then from a psychological perspective, if we're like, okay, well, I'm just a sinner and that's all I am, and I can't ever get better, then I can see how that would be potentially quite overwhelming, in the sense of, well, hang on a second, where is the hope if I'm just a sinner and that's all I can ever be? So the rest of I'll leave that for Father Nick, but from a psychological component, it'd be like, hang on a second, there's more to it than just that.
Well, I'll answer that question with a story from the Desert Fathers, which I've told to many people, especially in confession. Okay, it is a very important story to take on board and understand. You may not understand it immediately, but I'll just give you a couple of seconds and then I'll explain what it means. Okay, so the story goes like this. A couple of young men from a desert monastery in Egypt were sent up to the Big Smoke in Alexandria, Egypt, which was the second metropolis in the Roman Empire, with around about 1 million people, which was huge in the ancient world, to do some on the business of the monastery. Okay. So, and while they were there, both of these young men succumbed to temptations of the flesh and fell with women. So,
who would have thought?
Yeah. So they're going back to the monastery, and one of them beats his breast and says, "Oh God, how could I have done this? I hate myself." Okay? Whilst his friend is walking along cheerfully and singing psalms. Right? Okay? They did exactly the same thing. Okay? Different reactions. Now, the guy who was beating his breast could not live with himself in the monastery context and returned to the world. And the cheerful sinner became a good monastic. All right? So think about that for a couple of seconds and I'll explain to you what the... Helen's smiling. Okay, well, the answer to this goes like so. The guy who was beating his breast actually had such an inflated picture of himself that it's what we call pride in spiritual terminology, right? And sometimes people who are very pharisaical and proud do not see that. They attribute, and sometimes we know that they seem to be even performing miracles, and they get a following. That's really scary. Okay. But it's all pride, and a very proud person can be so proud, and that pride, like the alpha male wolf or dog, can suppress all other passions, all other drives. And the person may seem very humble, very pious, very saintly. Okay, so that's, wow, a delusion based on pride. Okay, and that is, the person has been lying to themselves. Okay, this is what I said about we need to know ourselves, because we have constructed a protective facade, a persona that is false self. We have to know the true self, who we really are. And the other guy who was cheerful and happy, almost skipping along, where after he fell, he prayed to God and asked for forgiveness, and he said something like this in his prayer: God, you know who I am, and I know who I am. He knew the reality, that he's weak and he's a sinner. He said, well, give me another chance. So he was able to accept God's forgiveness, okay, and to forgive himself. The psychologist would say, forgiving yourself is important. Okay. So, so a person, unfortunately, I find that people bring lots of distorted things into spiritual life, and sometimes it's not so easy even to see them straight away. But then, and the other thing, unlike a monastery, male or female, where people can be very direct. They'll say things right in your face about who you are, and that's great, that's helpful. But imagine if people in the world, and that includes a parish, sometimes I really wish I could say to that person what their real problem is, because they can't see themselves at all. And they think that they're doing one thing and they're doing something else, because they've constructed this persona. But my problem is that sometimes I'm a little bit too careful with people, because I know that you can traumatize a person. If you
I can too.
when I was a young seminarian, you know how many things I got straight into,
you want to help.
So, but in retrospect, I was so grateful to these people, to these monastics, especially elder monks, the older monks, that they could be so direct, but they were loving, tough love. That's what it is, tough love. Question is, are people willing to accept tough love from their parish priest? Okay? So, I have to be careful sometimes there. I don't want to traumatize them, otherwise I'll have to send them to you.
I can traumatize them just as easily. But I think too, self-compassion is very difficult, but it's also too, and I see a lot of clients who struggle with the trauma that has occurred in their life to also have self-compassion. And as I said, a lot of them, the vast majority, it's children that have suffered in childhood and now adults, and still cannot, as I said, if you can speak to a part of yourself as you would a child that you love, as you would your child, what would you say? And this is a technique that you can do now, even for yourself when you notice anxiety. So even in these days, so what would you say to a child that you love about what you're experiencing, and then speak to yourself in that same way? It's like, you know what, it's okay. Yeah, you're a little bit scared, but you know what? I, as in you, God, we've got you, okay? And having that sort of sense of, okay, hang on a second, as opposed to the harshness, the judgment, the hate, that self-loathing, which is difficult to live with and to work with. But that's more that's not a simple answer, and it's a big question that I can't adequately answer, but hopefully just touch on. Any more, Father Nick?
Yeah, well, the person who asked the question about, he says it's not that just a sinner, but that I'm bad, okay? Well, look, I want to clarify that in that story, see, the person there felt always that he was good, and suddenly he thought, how is it possible? I'm bad, okay? So he couldn't cope with that badness.
Yeah.
And he couldn't deal with it because he had no way of referring it to God and quickly, getting rid of it.
Yep.
Okay? So you're saying, I'm not saying about particular sins, but being sinful is bad. Hard to accept sin is about missing the mark. Growing blame in families leaves a deep scar of being a bad person. Well, that's really more psychological stuff, isn't it? Because there's a lot of that in families.
And that's what I'm alluding to, probably more is trauma-based. And as I say, trauma doesn't need to be, acts of war or anything like that for a lot of us. And likewise, growing up in first-generation Australian migrant communities, our parents they learned English along the way. So really we all experienced various, and don't forget too also, this is another concept. No, I'm not sure about your thoughts on this, Father Nick, but also from a psychological perspective, there's now transgenerational trauma, where in terms of it's not just necessarily what we experience as individuals, but it's also too we're subject to what our parents have experienced as individuals, or even to what our grandparents have experienced as individuals. And so, for example, what studies have shown and research has shown is children of the Holocaust survivors have really high rates of depression and anxiety, and they haven't lived through the war or the Holocaust. Yet as survivors of the children, the guilt of survival has come through to the children. So again, being mindful of what is ours to carry and what is ours to actually say, hang on a second, that's actually not mine. So talking about boundaries, which again for people that have experienced trauma, those boundaries can be quite porous. And sometimes as individuals, we actually accept far more in terms of what's within our circle than we really should. So we should only accept what is ours to carry or ours to deal with directly, as opposed to that belongs to my dad, my mum, my child, and I mean child as in terms of 18 and above or so, or my neighbour or my boss or my what have you. So being mindful of what are you actually carrying that and is yours to control and deal with, and what is actually not yours to carry.
We really should be rounding off, but look, just one last question, okay? All right, and then I'll just get up and say the prayer. A couple of people here, I think that I'll contact you later that probably need more time, okay.
Pastoral care.
But somebody's asking, what are your thoughts, Helen, on the modern world's love affair with mindfulness movement?
Good question. Mindfulness really, at the end of the day, at a really rudimentary level, is just being aware of this moment in time, full stop. I used to teach it at the hospital as part of the trauma program, and some patients would love it, and some patients would absolutely have a visceral response of just intense dislike. Mindfulness could almost be passed off as the new religion of sitting there and practicing mindfulness, but really all it is being aware of one's surroundings, one's presence. Like now, at the moment, I'm very mindful that I'm sitting on a chair. I'm in church, Father Nick's next to me, Dean's in front, the cameraman. The fact that you are all there, I'm present, as opposed to I'm not worried about what I'm going to do tomorrow at work. I'm not thinking about if my kids are in bed or not. I'm not thinking about... So being mindful is being present. That's my interpretation. Dare I say there's exercises and things and everything else that you can do with it. But the interesting thing, people that struggle with mindfulness also too are unable to practice self-compassion. Mm-hmm. So that's something that's come up in research. So I don't know if that's something that's to be explored at a later time.
The absolutely last one. Feeling that you're basically bad, feels that you're unlovable because you're such a bad person. Guilt. That's classic situation in families where a child begins to feel guilt, that they're bad. They must be bad because, their parents or whoever doesn't love me.
There's guilt and then there's shame. So
shame,
So needing to, I guess, differentiate. Guilt is very much a behaviour, so action, external, from a psychological perspective, I suppose. And then shame is very much internal. So I guess whether then what you're saying is depends. Did you engage in actions that you feel guilty about, that weren't agreeable to the family of origin, or did they make you feel shameful about engaging in activities that weren't agreeable? But also to either whether it be guilt or whether it be shame, again, it's very much that sense of acceptance and knowing to what is it related to. Is it related to actions, or shame typically tends to be more general and all-encompassing. It's I am shameful because I am bad. So whether it be I'm not meeting the expectations of family or you've done something wrong, but again, can be addressed in therapy from a psychological perspective.
Yeah. Anyway, look, Helen, I'd like to thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I can't even read all the thank you messages that people have sent.
Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. Okay, and thank you, Father Nick, for actually the invitation.
It's been really great. And I hope that it has been beneficial for people to hear what you've said and to take on board some of the things that you've suggested. And maybe, we've complemented each other by tackling certain problems from two different angles or levels or whatever. Okay?
Thank you very much for your time as well.
So I'll say our usual prayer at the end of this. It is truly meet to bless thee, the Theotokos, ever blessed and most blameless, and the Mother of our God, more honourable than the cherubim, beyond compare more glorious than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word, the very Theotokos. Thee do we magnify.